Pnawn da, croeso cynnes iawn i chi gyd. Good afternoon, very warm welcome. We're going to get going with the webinar. Croeso cynnes iawn i chi gyd. My name is Richard Wyn Jones, and I, along with Jack Lanner, will be presenting this afternoon, and we'll be looking back at the general election back in December in Wales, and we'll be looking at how people voted and exploring why we think that might be the case. This is a slightly belated presentation. There's now quite a long-standing tradition of colleagues in the Wales Government Centre attending Welsh party conferences and doing presentations on the most recent election or referendum, depending on what we've got data on. And it's usually well, it's an interesting experience in all kinds of ways, but one of the things which is most interesting is that the reception that we get varies hugely depending on who's done well in an election and who hasn't. And before the lockdown, we managed to give this presentation at the Conservative Party conference in Llangollen, and as you might imagine, we got a really warm reception. We were among the most popular people there that afternoon, at least that's how it felt. Unfortunately, we didn't get the chance to go to the Labour and Plaid conferences, where I suspect the reception wouldn't have been quite as warm. And unfortunately, we can't see you, so we've got no idea how you will respond. Apropos of which, what's going to happen is that Jack and I will present. That's going to take maybe 40-45 minutes, depending on how loquacious we're feeling today. At the end of that, there'll be an opportunity for you, we will then answer your questions. There's a question and answer box down below on this screen. If you've got a question, then please write it in there. And we will do our best to pick up as many questions as possible at the end. You're very welcome to tweet about the event as we go along, and I've been told that you can even use the hashtag, the venerable hashtag WGC events. The WGC Twitter account will be tweeting some of the key tables that we are going to be showing you as we go. So if you're interested, you can have a look at those. We'll also then be putting this whole presentation up on YouTube in the next couple of days. And also these slides, the slides which we're going to be showing you will be up on the WGC website very soon in the next couple of days. So obviously we're going to present you with a lot of data and talk about it. You'll probably want to circle back to some of it later on, and there'll be plenty of opportunity for you to do that. Okay, I think that's enough by way of introduction. So let's move on to the first slide, where I'll tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. A very quick overview of the general election results. Just to remind you, I suspect that nobody who's joining this call will need reminding, but we'll just do that for form's sake. Then we'll go on to the analysis, and we're dividing the analysis into two elements. And obviously we're focusing on Conservative gains, because that's ostensibly the main story of the election in Wales. And we'll be talking about short-term factors, and we're talking about long-term factors, and then we'll be saying a few things about the future, and then we'll be getting on to the questions that you will have posted by then. Okay, just remind ourselves of the result. And actually, this slide is worth just pausing over. Obviously, the key story is that Labour win again, that which is the non-story of every Welsh election since 1922. Labour win elections in Wales. But if you look at the right-hand side, what's really striking about this is we'll be focusing on Conservative gains in a moment. But I think the starting point is this is more a story of Labour loss than Conservative gain. So Labour have, by their standards, a historically poor election in Wales, but it's not the Conservatives piling on votes. Indeed, look at the Brexit Party piling on votes there. So this is a story, as we'll, for reasons we'll come back to in a moment, of Labour losing ground more than, in terms of the popular vote, more than the Conservatives necessarily gaining ground. Just a quick look at the map. And what we see on the map, again, this is very familiar territory to all of you, is that the Conservative, if you compare the 2017 election with the 2019 election, the 2017 election, that the Conservatives went into that with such high hopes in Wales. They were very, very hopeful about what they were going to achieve in North East Wales. Theresa May, of course, came to Bridgend to launch, and they were very confident of gaining ground, and ultimately they lost ground. But 2019 was the election that they were hoping to have in 2017, but didn't have. So they do incredibly well up in North Wales, even winning Ynys Môn, and they consolidate some territory in the south as well. Just in terms of how this fits into a longer historical pattern, I mentioned 1922, and I can go on and talk for a long time about one-party dominance. It is the key feature of Welsh democratic politics. There is no other democratic country in the world that I can think of or that I know of where you have such a long-standing pattern of one-party dominance. You can talk about Bavaria and the CSU, you can talk about liberal democratic Japan since the mid-50s, but Labour have won every serious national election in Wales since 1922. And it's just that this graph is interesting because we've got here both the vote share and the share of the seats. And what we see is Labour do incredibly well in terms of vote share, and that then is magnified, the effect of that is magnified by first past the post. And of course, if you believe in that voting system, the voting system is doing what it's meant to do, which is magnify that victory. That's the whole point of first past the post. And so what we see here is this ingrained, incredibly long-standing Labour domination, further magnified by first past the post. But of course, in that century-old pattern, more or less, 2019 being one of the poorest results across that century. And then I'll stop and hand you over to Jack.
Okay, so when we're trying to explain the result of why people voted the way they did, we're going to divide the presentation, as Richard's already said, into looking at some of the short-term factors. These are factors that tend to be unique to one single election or maybe one or two elections, and also look at some of the long-term trends which kind of, over time influence how people vote. And as political scientists, we often talk about this as a funnel of causality. So as you can see along the bottom, we've got time, and at the end here, we've got vote choice. So here's just a way of thinking of okay, all the things that might affect why someone votes the way they do. So we've got things like very early on that you acquire very early on in life, social demographics, things you acquire through socialization, growing up. These then will influence the values you have. This influences the party you might support politically. And then at any given election, you've got the issues and the candidates. So these are kind of the things we think of as the short-term factors. And then here we have kind of some of the more longer-term trends and processes. And in the middle, you kind of think about partisanship, or the party that someone supports is kind of somewhere in between the two. A lot of the data we're going to be talking about today comes from the 2019 Welsh election study. So this was a big survey we carried out in Wales by YouGov across 2 waves. So basically we asked about 2,000 respondents in Wales a series of questions before the election, and then we asked the same group of respondents straight after the election another series of questions. And through this data, we try and ask as many of the same questions as we've asked in previous election studies in Wales. This allows us to compare changes across time and also to ask a lot of the same questions they were asking in Scotland. And then at the bottom there's the information about, so it was funded by the ESRC, and the actual project is that we've also worked with Dan Wincott and Ed Poole. So, short-term factors. So, yeah, the Brexit election. So basically 2019 really was, or played out as the election that the Conservatives probably wanted to have or should have had in 2017. Brexit was the single issue which dominated all else. A lot of the other issues really struggled to break through, which meant that the Labour Party in particular really struggled from that point of view. But the messaging was very, very focused, was very, very clear, especially from the Conservatives, that it was all about Brexit. But you don't just have to take our word for it. In the survey, we asked respondents the following question. So as far as you're concerned, what is the single most important issue facing the UK? And this was an open question. So that means that rather than having a kind of a pre-selected set of answers that people can tick or say that they agree with, people can type in anything they want in this box. So you get a really wide variety of responses. And it also prevents us as, political scientists, people who are probably, or well, definitely more interested in politics than the average person, from kind of putting in some of our biases, what we think might be important at the time. So with this information, we're basically going to show you a series of word clouds now. So this basically just picks up the key words and phrases from over 2,000 people, respondents' answers. So if we think about the sample as a whole, so all 2,000 respondents, these are the words that really stand out. And as you can see, when I say words, what I really mean is that it's just one word that's completely dominating. So obviously, the vast majority of people mention Brexit as being the single most important issue facing the UK in the run-up to the election. You also have a few people also mention things like the NHS, climate change, the environment, the economy, normally one of the kind of more central and important features of an election. Didn't play as much, but you might argue that for a lot of people, concerns about Brexit also encapsulates concerns about the economy. But what we're going to do next is actually split the sample again between Leave voters and Remain voters. And we do this because the Leave-Remain divide has been kind of one of the central divide in politics in the last few years since the referendum. So if we look at Remain voters, we actually see there's a fair amount of variation. So we still see that Brexit really dominates, but we also see a lot of other issues that people are talking about, in particular the NHS and the environment. So those are kind of the three main issues that Remain voters were interested or thought were very important going into the election. We also see kind of phrases that you can imagine people typing, such as stopping Boris Johnson or stop the Conservatives, that kind of thing. But again, so Brexit really dominates, but there is a bit more variety. When we look at Leave voters, however, that kind of variety of issues really disappears. Brexit dominates hugely. It was by far the most important issue for this group of voters. Another thing, and people do mention the NHS, but hardly anywhere near as much. Another key thing, I think, or interesting thing here is just the sheer number of people who typed in the actual Conservative election slogan, this "Get Brexit Done," almost is the same number of people who typed in the NHS for the Leave voters. So this phrase and this kind of campaign message from the Conservatives, this message discipline really cut through to the voters that they were trying to get interest, or rather get votes from. We can also look at how the campaign maybe changed what issues were important. Now this data is taken from the Welsh Barometer polls, so they're the ones that run by Welsh Governance Centre with Roger Scully and then with ITV Wales. As you can see, this compares, sorry, by the way, this compares results from October and December of 2019. So basically the campaign period for the general election in 2019. As you can see, by far, again, the most important issue people thought was leaving the EU, with over half of all respondents saying this. This didn't really change throughout the campaign. We do see big changes, though, however, in health, and this is probably due to the Labour campaign and the Labour really pushing health as an issue. And we also see a big drop for things like crime as an issue, but also more powers for Wales. And that's very normal at a general election where almost all the news and media coverage and the parties are talking about the UK as a whole and talking about UK issues. So Wales-specific issues tend to be sidelined during general election campaigns. And here now we can break down by party what people thought the most important issue was. So again, plurality at least of every single one of the main party voters thought Brexit was the most important issue. So over 65% of Conservative voters in 2019 thought Brexit was the most important issue. Almost 80% of Brexit Party voters, that's not surprising at all. Nearly 60% of Lib Dem voters thought Brexit was the most important issue. But again, for say Labour Party, there's more of a spread. So quite a few Labour Party voters thought healthcare was the most important issue. Quite a few thought the environment was. And the same for Plaid, the same pattern there. So next thing in terms of short-term factors we're going to talk about is the leaders and the candidates. So we know from previous research that kind of perceptions of leaders and candidates in particular is quite important to how people think about the parties and definitely in terms of predicting how someone's going to vote. How we look at this this is kind of a standard question surveys, and it's basically you're giving someone's name, a leader's name, and you're basically asked on a 0 to 10 scale how much you like that person. So these are results from the pre-election wave we had. So quite interestingly, although we can talk about it a bit more in the next slide, Adam Price is the most popular leader in Wales that we asked about. That does come with a caveat that we'll talk about in a minute. But in terms of the UK leaders, Boris Johnson was very, very popular at the time. As far as I'm aware, the most popular Conservative leader that we've ever really had polling on. Also, perhaps just as remarkably, is Nicolas Sturgeon is actually the third most popular party leader in Wales, even though, of course, her party isn't standing candidates in Wales. More popular than both Mark Drakeford and Jeremy Corbyn. Finally, then we have Joe Swinson and Nigel Farage around the same point, and then finally Paul Davies. That also comes with a caveat, because for these three Welsh leaders, Adam Price, Mark Drakeford and Paul Davies, a considerable number of respondents didn't really know who they were. And that's what this slide shows. This is the percentage of respondents when asked this likability question who answered don't know. So the majority of respondents in Wales in our sample didn't know who Paul Davies was. They hadn't heard of him. They couldn't answer the question. And then nearly half of respondents weren't sure who Adam Price was, and about 40% or so didn't know who Mark Drakeford was. Another caveat here is that this is obviously data from December. Looking at more recent barometer polling for Mark Drakeford, this number's gone down a lot. Now Mark Drakeford is known far more by far more people. He's actually more people are able to ask this question now in more recent polls than they are about Keir Starmer, the UK Labour leader. But at the time, yes, not many people knew who Mark Drakeford was. And this is important for Labour in Wales, where in previous elections, in particular in 2017, there was some reliance on the Carwyn Wyn Jones brand. Most people in Wales knew who Carwyn Wyn Jones was. He was very popular, and therefore they relied on that. This time, Labour in Wales weren't able to do that. So they weren't able to rely on the Welsh Labour brand because people didn't know who was in charge. And finally, what we're going to show you is the kind of short-term volatility in the electorate. So when we talk about volatility in the electorate, we're basically talking about a lot of changing. in the electorate, instability. Now, what this, I'm sure some of you may have seen graphs like this before, and while they're very pretty, they're not always the most straightforward to explain, so I'll do my best. But on the left-hand side here, we have how people voted at the 2015 general election, how they voted in the middle in 2017, and how they voted in 2019. And what these flows are showing is how individual voters move from one party to another between elections. So the key thing here, I suppose, is this from between 2015 and 2017 is this huge flow of UKIP support into the Conservatives. Sorry. Fly in the throat. So huge flow of support, transfer of support from UKIP to the Conservatives, and then also in terms of for Labour in 2017, the kind of saving grace was actually the support from a lot of other parties. So the Lib Dems, Plaid Cymru in particular. This is a very common kind of pattern you see, that at general elections, Plaid Cymru voters tend to lend their vote to the Labour Party. In 2019, the key difference there for the Labour is that this Plaid Cymru voters did not lend in anywhere near as bigger chunks lend their support to Labour. That support wasn't coming. And the same for the Lib Dems. In fact, more Lib Dems and more Plaid Cymru voters from 2017 went to the Conservatives than they did to Labour. So we can talk about, and I'm sure Luke's going to tweet out that one, so you can all digest it a bit more now. But now I'll pass you back to Richard, who's going to talk about some of the long-term factors.
Okay, diolch Jack. In terms of voting, I'm going to just look at some of the kind of broad patterns, and I'm going to do this in very broad brush terms. If you've ever done a politics undergraduate course, you will. There's a kind of quote which Jack is going to shift to now. There's a quote about voting in Britain, which there are so many essays which have basically had this quote and then the word discuss after it. Class is the basis of British party politics, all else is embellishment and detail. And for many, many years, people writing about elections in Wales, in Britain, Northern Ireland was always seen as a world apart. It would be about class, and actually the trick was to explain what they used to call class deviance. So you were explaining the people who were voting for the wrong party. Who were these strange working class people who were voting for the Conservatives? Who were these strange middle class people who were voting for Labour? That it was seen as being absolutely central, and it still is. In particular in Wales, so there's a bit of evidence which we're not going to talk about, which I know is annoying for me to refer to evidence we're not going to show you, but we know that people in Wales still think predominantly in class terms when they think about politics. So we thought that one interesting thing would be to show you the relationship between class and voting in the 2019 election and how that has changed. And this is a pretty striking graph, and I think will be counterintuitive to a lot of people who are interested in Welsh politics. So this shows social grades D and E and how they voted in different elections going back to 1997. What you see is this extraordinary change from the kind of the beginning of the century where 85% plus of social grade D and E was voting for Labour, to a point in 2019 where a toss of a coin had equal predictive power in terms of as compared to class. Now this is very crude. There's much more to class than this. In particular in Wales, there's a really interesting relationship between objective class, so what people's incomes are, and subjective senses of class. And Wales is actually quite different in interesting ways from England on this. So people are more likely to call themselves working class, even if objectively their income might be considered to make them middle class. So there are all kinds of complications going on here, which we don't really have time to get into. But nonetheless, this is really striking in terms of asking some fundamental questions as to the extent to which class is still an important determinant of voting. One of the things which is clearly, and there's a lot of literature now which talks about the importance of age in voting and the relationship. I mean, we were showing at the Conservative conference lots and lots of good news for the Conservatives, and they tended to be pretty happy. The faces dropped when we showed this table. This is the relationship between Conservative support in Wales and year of birth at the time of the 2019 general election. And that is an extraordinary age gradient, where the Conservatives are performing very, very strongly amongst the oldest cohorts, but are performing horribly among the youngest group. Now, of course, there's all kinds of questions as to what this means for the future. Do people get more conservative as they get older, or will the kind of attrition of time mean that the Conservatives are losing their core support? But that should be very, very worrying for the Conservatives. There's also some really interesting literature about education and the relationship between education and voting. But in the Welsh context, the thing that we've focused a lot on since people started looking at elections in Wales is the relationship between national identity and voting. And I guess those of you who've done anything on elections in Wales will be aware of the research that Dennis Balsam and his colleagues carried out in the early 80s and what has become known as the Three Wales model. And that argued that national identity was absolutely crucial to understanding voting in Wales, and in particular why we've seen this long-term pattern of Labour dominance in Wales, and why we have a nationalist party, a regional or a nationalist party in Wales. And kind of crudely, what that literature suggested, what that research suggested, that Welsh identity, feeling Welsh, was correlated strongly with support for Labour and Plaid Cymru, and the differentiator there between Labour and Plaid was what they called cultural attachments, so relationship to the Welsh language and other cultural factors. British identity in Wales was correlated strongly with support for the Conservative Party. Now, again, without going into this in too much detail, recent research has shown, and we've got a piece coming out on the Brexit referendum in Wales, Scotland and England compared. Jack, Dan, Ed and our colleague Ilse Henderson and I have a piece coming out in Regional Studies in the next few days, I think, imminently at least, which shows that national identity still matters, but, and there's an important caveat, the pattern is much more complicated than was obvious, I think, in the early 80s, because English identity has become much more significant. And of course, the demographics of Wales mean that we have a substantial group of the Welsh electorate who feel strongly English. Also, it's clear that differentiating between Welsh and British identity is too crude. Some people do feel Welsh and not British. Some people feel British and not Welsh. But a lot of people feel both. And our understanding of this, I think, is now more sophisticated. Nonetheless, it's very clear that Wales, which is actually the most complicated of the four territories of the UK, the most heterogeneous in national identity terms, it matters hugely politically. And just to show you, just to illustrate how this works, so this is the pattern in 2017. And what you see here, if we can start at the bottom, is that Labour and does particularly well amongst people who feel Welsh only. That's around a quarter of the Welsh electorate. So Labour do really well in this group. This is where Plaid Cymru's main supporters. This is where the Conservatives do most poorly. The largest group in the Welsh electorate, and as I said, it's a very heterogeneous group, the largest group is the people who feel strongly British and strongly Welsh. That's around, off the top of my head, that's around 27% of the Welsh electorate as a whole. Here it's much more even between Labour and the Conservatives, but Labour traditionally have an advantage here. Amongst the British English, which is the next largest group, and that's around 15–16% of the Welsh electorate, that's a part of the electorate where the Conservatives do really well compared to Labour. I'm not going to go through all of these, I've just focused on the most important. If we can then look at what happened in 2019, what you see, and actually let's jump, Jack, to the next slide, because we'll show the changes between 2019 and 2017. What's interesting here, if you look at that Welsh-only group, is that this is where Labour take a real kicking. It's among this group. And interestingly, if we'd looked at the comparison of 2015 to 2017, in the 2017 election, Labour did really well amongst the Welsh-only group. Welsh identifiers piled in to Labour, I think voting tactically to hold back what was expected to be a big Conservative advance. And as I said on the BBC on Sunday, there's a really interesting question as to why the Welsh Labour brand wasn't mobilised. And Jack said they weren't able to do it because Mark Drakeford didn't have the recognition that his predecessor, Carwyn Wyn Jones, did. Well, I'm sure that's part of the story, but neither was there a real attempt to mobilise that brand. And it's one of the interesting things about 2019, and it's a question we can't answer. But what if Labour had actually made more of an effort to shore up their position amongst the Welsh-only voters by utilising this brand, which was clearly so successful for them in 2017? I can talk a lot about this, but I'm going to eschew the temptation. Let's just move on to the final slide, where we just have some parting thoughts, and then we'll move to any questions that you may have. And I should remind you, if you've got questions, then stick them in the Q&A box down below, and we'll try and deal with them as best we can. So some parting thoughts. Is class voting becoming obsolete in Wales? This will be a rude shock to lots of people in Wales, especially those people with a strong Welsh identity who have a really interesting way of combining class and national narratives. But that evidence from social group DE, which you would have thought is the hardcore in terms of class voting, suggests that there may be other factors, and we've seen this very clearly in England, where our research in England shows that people with a strong sense of English identity, be they working class or middle class, are really moving away from Labour in great numbers since 2015, because it appears that there are other factors other than class that are affecting their perception, so values interlinked with identity maybe. So what is happening in Wales in that space? The second question is about demographic change and how will that have an impact on Labour dominance. If Labour dominance in Wales is based on Welsh identity, historically, if that's the thing that explains why Labour Welsh Labour always outperform Labour in England, if it's Welsh identity that explains that, then does demographic change in Wales and potentially the weakening of Welsh identity as we see population flows, does that mean that there's a real issue in terms of Labour's long-term dominance? There's a really interesting question which I think is going under the radar at the moment. That there are certainly political activists who are aware of this, but I think lots of people who are interested in politics and even journalists and analysts are ignoring this. We are going to see a big reduction in the number of Welsh MPs. The equalisation of constituency sizes across the UK means that Wales will lose more seats proportionately than any other part of the UK. We're going down to 31, 32 seats in Wales. Obviously, a lot depends on how, we don't know what the boundaries will look like. But if we, as a result of that, see more proportionate electoral outcomes in Wales, then that raises interesting questions about long-term Labour dominance. If, as Jack has, I think convincingly, at least convincingly to us, argued, this was a Brexit election, when and how will the direct impact of Brexit recede? And I think there's an open question there. There is, I think there is an assumption amongst many on the Remain side, or people who are less comfortable with the Leave territory, that politics will return to normal once Brexit recedes. I think that is far from a foregone conclusion, actually. We might come back to that. And finally, and Jack's already alluded to some of this, all of this now, we have this quite a strange sensation working on academic papers on the 2019 election, because it already feels such a long time ago. Back in December 2019, hardly any of us, except those of us who followed the news from China very closely, had heard of COVID-19 or anything like it. Since then, it's turned Welsh politics on its head, arguably. I think there's a very different awareness of devolution. Certainly, there's a heightened awareness of devolved politicians, or at least Mark Drakeford. What are the long-term effects of this? Indeed, what are the short-term effects? Because we're going to have another election in Wales next May, almost certainly. So, yeah, so we'll see some of the ways that this works out very soon. And I suspect that the optimism that was on display in Llangollen when we gave the first version of this talk will have receded somewhat in Welsh Conservative hearts and minds. And I think that's us. And so it's over to you. And so what I'll do is read out some of the questions that we have. And the first question is from Aled Jones. And the question is, how important was the Tory Brexit non-pact pact in 2019? And as it happens, we're writing a paper on this, which I'm going to allow Jack to try unfairly to summarise. So Jack, can you talk about the Tory Brexit pact, and maybe, because I know we've got interesting things to say about that, the equivalent on the other side, so the Remain alliance?
Yeah, so obviously the Conservative Brexit Party pact, that wasn't a pact. It was very obviously one-sided. So it obviously worked pretty well for them, the Conservatives. There is some debate about actually whether those kind of people who said they were going to vote for the Brexit Party would have just ended up voting for the Conservatives anyway, the closer it got to the election. But the kind of important thing was that it was around this like key central issue that was very, very important for both sets of voters. And that was a big contrast to the so-called Remain alliance, where while kind of Brexit was important for that group of parties, actually the kind of, again, going back to identities that these supporters of different parties had was really wildly different, like really, really very different. So whereas the kind of Brexit Party Conservative alliance or deal was easy for people to jump over, because a lot of the people who said they would support the Brexit Party in polling and things like that, they felt very British. That was a very important identity to them. Also, a lot of them felt very English in Wales as well. And that was kind of an easy jump to the Conservatives, who in Wales, historically at least, have been seen as being an English party. This is something that they've always struggled with in Wales, trying to shake that perception. Among the Remain Alliance parties, however, you had kind of, Plaid Cymru, who feel very, very Welsh. Then you have the Liberal Democrats, who tend to feel very, very British. They don't particularly feel that Welsh. And then kind of Labour, obviously, who weren't actually part of the pact in Wales, but kind of somewhere in between. So was it important? Yeah, it probably did have an impact. It probably did help the Conservatives where the Brexit Party stood down. I suppose the big what if is if the Brexit Party had actually stood down in seats with Labour incumbents, especially one or two more of those kind of South Wales seats, particularly in the valleys, and the final seat up in the northeast, whether those seats would have fallen. I think it's possible, particularly in the northeast, that would have been the case. But interesting hypothetical.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of just points to pick up on that. I think. That very first slide where we were looking at the vote shares, it is still striking that the Brexit Party were picking up votes when there were Conservative candidates that were available, and potentially, I think, still that kind of historic resistance that you find to voting for the Conservatives, in particular amongst the British Welsh. Those people who would have a strong identity, Welsh identity as well as being strongly British. And I think that whether it would have led to more seats changing hand, we can't know. But I think that the 2019 result would have been even more traumatic psychologically to Labour, to Welsh Labour in particular, if the Conservative votes had piled up even higher in some of those valley seats. And then just to kind of repeat the point about the opposite side, I mean, it is really striking. We've been looking at the data. We're writing a paper at the moment about the Remain Alliance between the Greens, Plaid, and the Lib Dems, and it's complete failure. It's utter and complete failure. And what's interesting, and obviously the contrast with the other side of the argument, and what's interesting is that Liberal, Democrat and Plaid voters are identical on the so-called libertarian, authoritarian scale. They map almost exactly onto each other. They're very, very similar on left, right, and yet we can't find any of them crossing over to vote for the other party. It's just in our sample of 2000, we actually didn't find any in the seats where the pact was I can't remember how many constituencies. Was it 11 constituencies in Wales where the pact was active in Wales? We didn't find one respondent who jumped between either Lib Dems and Plaid or Plaid and Lib Dems. It just didn't work at all. Yeah. Okay, so we can digress on that one, but let's move on to the next question from Peter Jenkins. Diolch, Peter. Oh, this is actually something I know that Jack has been writing a paper on this week. How often do we see national identity shift, timescale-wise, and is there any potential reason, with a growing interest in the independence movement, to suspect that national identity on a personal level is more fluid than static? Over to you, Jack.
Yeah, so Dan Wincott and I have a paper looking at exactly this question. So under what circumstances and how do national identities change over time? So a couple of things to point out. The first is that we've been looking at the effect of big critical events that we call, say. So in particular, we look at, say, the Scottish independence referendum, in Scotland, obviously, and then the 2016 EU referendum. What we find in Scotland, the paper's not out yet, it's still a working paper, but what we found in Scotland is basically, in the short term, in the immediate aftermath, everyone who voted yes became quite a bit more Scottish. They felt more Scottish and they felt less British. That didn't happen for no voters in the immediate aftermath. However, over time, since then, over the last few years, everybody in Scotland now feels less British and more Scottish. So that's the direction. It just keeps going up, basically, at every wave of this big British elections study. It's a big repeated survey. In the EU referendum, we find kind of similar results, not so much in Scotland, but in Wales we found really, really strong, big results. Basically, everybody in Wales seemed to feel more Welsh and less British since the EU referendum. That means that's whether you voted Remain or Leave. Remainers in particular feel particularly more Welsh and less British. In England, seems to be a different story. National identity kind of between English and Britishness does seem to fluctuate slightly more. I think that's because for a lot of people, the two things mean the same thing. Whereas in Wales and Scotland, they're more clearly differentiated in a lot of people's minds, at least. Whilst you don't tend to see really dramatic changes, so you don't really find anyone who feels very, very, very strongly British but not Welsh, for example. They don't suddenly become very, very, very Welsh and don't feel British at all. That doesn't happen. But you do kind of see movement between kind of the two poles. And in our data, at least, it seems to be, well, in Scotland and Wales, heading in one direction, and that's people feeling less British. And that data, that timeline we've looked at is from early 2014 until, when would it be, late 2019.
So I think, so just the only thing I'd add to that is the caveat that there has been what's ended up as kind of trendless fluctuation in the past. Now, I think there are good reasons, there are good kind of theoretical reasons to look at the evidence that Jack and Dan have put together and think, yeah, there is something longer term going on here. But we have seen flopping about over the last, well, going back to the late 70s, actually, where we've got our first identity data. Now, they're measuring it slightly differently, et cetera, but there has been some fluctuation which has ended up cancelling itself out over time. I suspect that there is more going on here. You would imagine that the 2014 referendum in Scotland is one of those critical moments after which everything changes. But, you know, obviously we need more, as good political scientists, we always need more data and more time points. Here's another question from anonymous attendee. Diolch, anonymous attendee. Oh, I knew we were going to get this. Considering the information you presented on nationality, what is your initial take on Keir Starmer's speech today in which he sought to reframe Labour as a party of patriotism and the Union? Is it as easy as simply busting out the Welsh Labour brand at the next general election to counter any spillover and or hoping that Keir's message is more salient in the English seats than that Labour need to win? That's a really good question. Jack, do you want to kick off on that? So,
yeah, it is a good question. We were kind of discussing this before the presentation started, actually. Well, there's a lot there. Well, I suppose the first few things is that just some previous stuff, research we've done, like Welshness, Welsh identity and voting Labour are very closely correlated. British identity and voting Labour isn't in Wales anyway. It's different. It is different in England. So yeah, I'm not particularly sure about that. We do have an interesting slide actually about, well, this slightly unrelated to the national identity, but I could show you. So it's this slide on.
It's an opportunity to show you an extra slide, so yeah. We're not going to pass it up.
So the next slide, if I show you, this is a bonus one. Okay, so this is looking at constitutional preferences by party identification. So basically, when people say, do you think of yourself as closer to one party? And this is comparing the results from the Scottish election study and the Welsh election study. Now, we've done some work in blogs and things, putting out kind of stuff that looks similar to this. Well, I suppose the key things to look at here is, for Keir Starmer and the Labour Party in Wales as well, is where the distribution of people here is. So I should just say, for the question, we asked people on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is abolish the Welsh Assembly as it was then in December, or 10 is independence. Where would you place yourself? You know, what would you like to see? And then these kind of, this is like the distribution of where people are. So where it's higher, there's more people, basically. And these dotted lines is where the median, or the median supporter places themselves for each party. So in Wales, we see that actually Labour supporters are going towards independence. They want more powers, at least. They don't want things to stay as they are. They want more devolution. There's also reason to believe that since December, this has changed as well. We've seen a couple of YouGov polls which seem to suggest that Labour voters are now might actually be trending towards not just more powers, but actually independence. So that's the big kind of, this is the big problem for Labour in Wales. Not maybe problem, but this is the big question that they need to deal with. In Scotland, it's actually surprisingly the same. So Labour voters in Scotland aren't as keen on independence as Labour voters in Wales, but still, they still want more devolution in Scotland. So I think it'll be interesting to see what, you know, the idea of more Britishness, especially when we've just said, you know, people are trending away from the idea of British identity. Maybe Keir thinks he can turn that around, but
yeah.
You know.
Can I just so just on the back of the slide that Jack was showing, one of the interesting things, I'm sure you will have noticed the Brexit Party profile in Wales, and one of the things which I've been saying a lot since we started doing serious research on this is that there's a tendency. So yeah, the bottom right hand side is that there's an assumption that Brexit Party voters in Wales are anti-devolution. That is wrong. There are some people who are both anti-European and anti-devolution. And in fact, there are a lot of Conservative supporters who are anti-European and anti-devolution. The situation is different with Brexit Party supporters because Welsh identity tends to be stronger among those. And there is a group of people who are strongly British and strongly Welsh, who are both hostile to Europe and actually pro-devolution. But can I just come back to the question and Starmer? I'd say just 3 things very quickly about this. First of all, what Starmer said today is not new. It's being treated by some people in the media as if it's some incredible new policy. It's very much what the New Labour were saying. New Labour appointed a patriotism czar. I don't know if that's part of Starmer's plan, but they were talking a lot about Britishness and the Union, and I wrote an article about this at one time. At the moment, they're saying nothing that's new, but I suspect that and clearly this is being greeted as being incredibly clever. They do need to deal with identity, but it's a very difficult terrain for Labour for 2 reasons. One is that this really creates problems for them in Scotland for reasons that Jack has already alluded to, i.e. Scotland is becoming more Scottish. So what does that mean? Does it mean that Scotland's Labour are basically giving up on Scottish Labour? Arguably they might as well, but it's a huge admission for them because it makes the route to a majority very, very difficult for them. And that leads to my 3rd point, because Labour still have nothing to say about England. And what we saw in the 2015 general election, and Ailsa Henderson and I have got a book, so I'm advertising shamelessly. Ailsa and I have got a book coming out in the new year with Oxford University Press called Englishness, which looks at the 2015 general election in England and the Brexit referendum. And what you can see very clearly is that the Conservatives mobilise very effectively fear of the SNP and an idea that Scotland is in somehow exploiting England in the Union. And the idea of Labour being, as they would call it, being propped up by the SNP is very, very unpalatable to English voters. And Labour have, if they're essentially abandoning Scotland by talking about Britishness, then basically, if they're going to have any chance of forming a government, realistically, they're reliant on some kind of coalition with the SNP. And, that is a real problem for them in England in particular. So I have to say, slightly less impressed with with what's happened today. I think it's, they're at least acknowledging that they have an issue and a problem, but I suspect that the way they're dealing with this, which is very comfortable to lots of people on the soft left and the so-called right of the Labour Party, they're comfortable in this terrain talking about Britishness, but it doesn't get them out of the problem that they have. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant, wasn't it? I do apologise. Okay, next question from David Llewellyn. Davis, diolch David. The word maze didn't seem to mention Jeremy Corbyn much at all, yet we're told his unpopularity was a key factor in Labour loss of support. Any comment on this? Jack?
Well, some people did mention him. In some Leave Remain in the Cloud, you do see a few people talk about stopping Corbyn. I suppose the way the question was framed was, what's the single most important issue? So that might also have something to do with it, unless you think stopping Corbyn is the #1 issue, but you might think that there's other issues that are more important, or that you might see Corbyn as being a kind of a roadblock to, but that's not really what the question asked. We do know that he was there's data.
He was unpopular.
The data, the British election study has the same data. The Scottish election study shows the same thing. He was just unpopular among pretty much all groups of voters, including a lot of people who voted Labour in the past.
For the Labour leader to be less popular than Adam Price, okay, Boris Johnson, that in Wales, which has had a century of Labour dominance, less popular than Nicolas Sturgeon, whose party doesn't even stand candidates in Wales. There's no way of dressing that up.
I've gone back through since 2007, which is as far as I can find polling in Wales. And there's never been a UK Labour leader less popular than a Conservative leader. So it's kind of historic levels of unpopularity for Corbyn.
Okay, we've got more questions. So Laura Cropper, thank you, Laura. Diolch. You showed the environment feature as an area of significant interest in the 2019 election. Yeah, I guess. Do you have any more information on trends on this past or more recently? Diolch, Laura. Jack?
Just going up, as you kind of might expect, but it's kind of peaked a few months ago, which again you might expect, especially with the Extinction Rebellion protests really raised the salience of it. And it was going up among all groups of voters. It's obviously more important to certain voters, as we showed in the word clouds, obviously Green Party, but also Plaid Cymru. It was very important for a lot of Plaid Cymru voters and Labour voters as well. But it's kind of trending upwards among Conservative and Lib Dem voters as well. It's still, though, not really pushing the top 3, 4, 5 issues that people are thinking about, and that's where it needs to be. If it's going to really matter in an election, it needs to be the top 1, 2, or 3 issues that people are talking about. Yeah. Okay.
Questions are piling up here, and I'm getting prompts from Luke to get on with it. So there have been a few questions about Plaid, which we apparently haven't answered. So we're going to skip to what are we skipping to? Here we are. Despite performing well in TV debates, Adam Price and Plaid didn't really see any gains across Wales. If anything, lost more than they gained. Especially when they were tipped to take Ynys Môn. Why was this the case? So Plaid Cymru performance.
Do you want to start?
No, you can start.
Okay. Well, the last couple of general elections have been very difficult for Plaid. just because the big two parties have kind of redominated again. There's been a lot of tactical voting towards the two. There's been a big rise in what we would call negative partisanship, right? So it's not necessarily who you support is why that drives who you vote for. It's who you want to lose drives, or who you don't want to win, basically, is drives who you vote for. So as you can see, like in 2017, a lot of Plaid voters lent their vote to the Labour Party in an attempt to stop the Conservative Party from winning. For some early polls in Wales, which showed the Tories potentially had big leads potentially. That scared a lot of Plaid Cymru voters. So that's always a struggle for Plaid Cymru. Another thing is that also there isn't this, we talk about these things, it seems to be all the time, but there isn't a particularly strong domestic media in Wales. Therefore, a lot of people get their coverage of a general election from UK media, which don't really cover Plaid Cymru very often. There's also, we've showed the data about different national identity groups don't particularly feel that support Plaid Cymru. We had some really interesting. We actually asked people in an open question in the election study, why haven't Plaid Cymru been able to replicate the success of the SNP in Scotland? And basically, we had, again, it was an open thing, so people would type in whatever they wanted, and there's a blog published on it. But basically, the two big roadblocks seem to be independence. People thought that they're obsessed with independence, although of course SNP are as well. So I'm not sure if that's really a differentiation. And the Welsh language. I'm sure Richard can talk a lot more about that.
Well, and given the Plaid didn't support independence till 2003 formally, it's hard to blame Plaid's historic weakness on their apparent support for independence. So, yeah, I mean, I think that the premise of the question is interesting because Adam, especially with a view to next year, Adam Price is clearly a strong media performer, and despite the disappointment of, their disappointment at their result in 2019, where yet again they talked the talk and failed to deliver the gains they were promising, and actually were struggling rather to hang on to what they had. I suspect they would have felt relatively confident about next May because they have a strong performer, and in a context where few people knew any of the Welsh political leaders, they had the most popular one, which you would have thought would have been helpful in a devolved election, and we know that devolved contexts help Plaid Cymru. So in that regard, the transformation in the profile of Mark Drakeford is really quite bad news for Plaid Cymru, because now they're up against a figure who is much better known than Adam Price, and at the moment at least, and of course there's a lot to happen between now and next May, but at the moment is seen as doing a pretty good job. The other bit of the question which I think is worth reflecting on is this whole question of independence, because that is something that has, it's a huge surprise to me as somebody who's been an observer of Welsh politics for so long, to see the development of a genuine grassroots movement in favour of independence is surprising. To have the most recent YouGov poll showing a majority of Labour supporters supporting independence, it's difficult to know what impact that will have on a devolved election, and that may be more difficult for Labour. So on the one hand, Mark Drakeford trending up, really good news, but focus on the constitutional question, in particular in a context where the UK government may be trying to prune the powers of devolved government, might be a problem for them. As you can probably guess, we can talk about that for a long time. But I'm going to go on to the next question from Owen McArdle. This applies to so-called red wall seats in both Wales and England. But do you think the movements towards the Conservatives and away from Labour in those seats is a new phenomenon, or are they just starting to politically resemble areas with similar demographics in southern England, e.g. all the old Labour seats in Kent, places like Crawley, etc.? I'm hoping that Jack's knowledge of Crawley is better than mine. Jack, do you want to kick off with that? That's a really good question, Ryan. Diolch.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult to say, obviously, because it's just happened. So, what we do know is that the Brexit referendum and the whole process kind of provided a shock to the electoral system. So we talk about the electoral shock, and it created a new cleavage. So what that basically means is the kind of dividing line around which parties and voters therefore reorient themselves. And Brexit basically has caused that. So parties have had to kind of reorganise, and the battle lines have been redrawn, and same for voters. And so, while historically, we've often talked about class, for example, and also the battle between kind of left-right economics. That's kind of where the battle line was, right across this spectrum between left-wing parties, which was usually meant Labour for a lot of people, and right-wing parties, which usually meant Conservatives for a lot of people. That kind of divide isn't really as important anymore, or rather, it doesn't really distinguish between voters anymore. The most important thing now seems to be this authoritarian liberal or spectrum that we call it, and that's very highly correlated with EU referendum votes. So I suppose really it's a question of how long the Brexit referendum stays, or rather that divide stays salient and important. It could be, perhaps, that Brexit is sorted and everything goes back to how it was, or it could be that now this is kind of like the new normal now, and that we're actually seeing the start of like this big reorientation of voters and parties around this new cleavage.
So I got a slightly different. It's nice to have a slightly different take than Jack on this. And again, I refer you to an excellent book that will be published next year by Ilse Henderson and myself, which focuses on England and Englishness. And to some extent, I think what the Brexit referendum did was make manifest some things which were already there, and doubtless magnify them and maybe solidify them. But so it's very clear from, at least we think it's very clear from the evidence that we've amassed, that you had a position in England where people who feel strongly English, which is, the majority of the population of England, they feel strongly English and strongly British, but feeling strongly English, be that with Britishness or without, is the key thing. That's the differentiator. People who feel British but not English are very different. There was a strong sense of, there's a very specific sense of who they are, where they fit into the world, very, very strong sense of resentment about European integration, a sense that England and the English don't get fair treatment within Britain. That's partly a resentment against immigrants, very often a resentment against the position of Scotland. That's then tied to a set of values. It's not straightforward to pin down on the left-right scale, because it involves some elements of supporting the state, but also some elements of wanting the state to back off. And then now, Boris Johnson gets this stuff, this stuff about an Englishman going to the pub and how these fundamental freedoms. And so this stuff, it really matters. And I think that values and identity are really important in terms of how people vote. Labour were really struggling with English identifiers before the 2016 referendum in England. It's got even worse since. So I think that Labour have a longer-term problem here, and that nothing is nailed on. But I suspect that it's a longer term thing that's going to be much more difficult for them to turn around in the so-called red wall seats. And part of the problem is that Labour does very well amongst people with a strong sense of British identity, who don't feel English, who tend to be more liberal. And by trying to appeal to the traditional vote, those voters could easily peel away towards the Greens or the Lib Dems or some other formation. So I think there's a longer term problem here for Labour. That would be my guess anyway. Okay, next question. Stephen Thornton, diolch Steve, very succinct. Is there a way back for the Lib Dems? Jack, that's a hospital pass for you.
I don't know. I mean, it's hard. It's hard to see how. I mean, basically, I've not seen anything in any of these data sets that would suggest so in the short term anyway. They obviously had I suppose they obviously had a bit of a revival, a very short one under Joe Swinson in England, in particular around the European elections last year. But European elections, as we often say, aren't a particularly good indicator of actually where things are right now.
Yeah, I think I'm aware that there's an interesting kind of group of people in the Welsh Liberal Democrats who are trying to think about the future. The problem that they have is that there's not an obvious niche for them, and they're falling to such low levels that there aren't target seats are now. I mean, they had such a catastrophic election in Wales that all their target seats kind of evaporated.
And also, I suppose it's just what I was talking about earlier, in that when elections were fought on that kind of left-right battleground spectrum, they had an individual place. They were between these two big parties. Whereas on this more, if we think now that elections are now fought on a different spectrum, this authoritarian liberal spectrum, the Lib Dems aren't actually distinguished from really the Greens, Labour, Plaid Cymru, SNP. And so if that's where the battle is, it's very hard for them to distinguish themselves from any of those other parties and be a viable alternative.
And this is a distinction between the Welsh Lib Dems and the Scottish Lib Dems, because in Scotland they've become the kind of quite hardcore unionist party. Despite being historical home rulers and ostensibly a federal UK supporting party, they've essentially they've fully embraced this kind of division between unionism and nationalism, and they are firmly parked in the unionist camp. And there are particular constituencies where they're strong enough to be the most viable unionist candidate, which keeps them in the game. But that is not a split that we have. Welsh Labour, wisely so far, haven't fallen into that let's ally with the Conservatives to save the Union. Although I think they're now going to have more issues to think about in that territory. But there is a space for the Scottish Lib Dems, that there's a particular niche there. It might not be one that lots of Welsh Lib Dems are comfortable with, but allying with the Conservatives to save the Union makes a certain sense. It doesn't make sense for them in Wales. So it's, you can then, let's be the liberal kind of environmental green party in the bigger urban conurbations, but that is a well-populated space. So I'm tending to know Stephen, but I want to leave myself some wriggle room, if you don't mind. Next question. We've got about 12 minutes to go. Thank you. We're not going to be able to get through all the questions, I'm sure, but we're doing our best. Harry Thompson, diolch, Harry. Handling of the Welsh Government's response to the pandemic seems to have been much more well received than the UK government's amongst Welsh voters in the latest barometer polls. If this holds, do you think this will filter through to Senedd voting intentions ahead of May 2021? Or are the shifts in voting intention more about the tectonic plates of demographics in Wales, making Tory incursions more permanent? Sorry, I read that out really clumsily. Hopefully you were able to pick that up, Jack. I hope he did.
That's a very good question. Well, I suppose so. If things stayed as they are now, yeah, they would help Welsh Labour. They've come up. They're perceived to be doing better. That is actually a really common thing, though. It's not really new in the coronavirus pandemic. People always tend to think, no matter what the issue is, even if you almost make up an issue, people will just say, "Oh, yeah, the Welsh government do a better job at it than the UK government." So if things hold, yeah, that probably will help them. We know from previous stuff that perceptions of competence are important. How important you think they are in actually deciding people's vote is a bit of a contentious issue in the study of elections. But we know that they at least have some impact. So if you are seen as more competent than, say, the Conservatives, and then you successfully manage to tie the Conservatives in Wales to the Conservative government, if they're still unpopular at the time, then yeah, that likely would help. In terms of the demographic shifts, I don't think so. I don't think that is. I don't think that's deterministic like that. I think it's far more about rather like identities and things, which identities can change, although they don't change hugely, but more that kind of the alignment between certain identities and parties that can change. Yeah, or is it Richard? What do you think?
Well, no, I mean, it's a really, really good question, and if we knew the answer to it, we'd be, well, I'm a good Calvinistic Methodist, and obviously, and I don't bet, but I would otherwise be running down to the bookies to get some money on for the election next year. I think, there's the data on performance is striking, and as Jack said, we need to keep it in perspective, because we always find this. We always find that people tend to be kinder in their assessments of what the Welsh government is doing than the UK government, and people have, since the very early days of devolution, tended to trust Welsh politicians more. What may be different this time is that the salience is so much higher. Mark Drakeford is now a very well-known figure in Wales in a way that arguably it took Rhodri Morgan a decade to get to that point, and probably never got to this point. He's very, very well known. And the Conservatives, by contrast, are going to be heavily reliant on perceptions at the UK level. They've kind of basically done away with differentiating the Conservative brand in Wales from the Conservative brand at the London level. I mean, nobody knows who Paul Davies is, more or less.
I should say, Conservative voters don't know who Paul Davies is. Plaid Cymru supporters were more likely to know who Paul Davies was than Conservative voters in Wales.
And those people who do know who he is, and this may explain this, don't particularly tend to like him very much. So there's so I think so they're going to be very reliant on the UK level, and so it does look, at the moment, it looks positive. However, we don't know that this perception of the Welsh government being more competent, more trusted than the UK level is going to last. We've got a long way to go through the crisis. But you're asking the right questions, Harry. We've got a question in Welsh. We've had this session in through the Welsh language in the Eisteddfod. So I'm going to ask the question. It's from John Rowlands. Diolch, John. I'm going to ask the question and then translate it and answer it in English. Fydd Caerdydd ein prifddinas yn parhau'n wahanol I weddill Cymru? Will Cardiff, our capital city, remain different from the rest of Wales? I'm not sure I actually understand that question entirely, because I'm not sure that Cardiff is necessarily that different from the rest of Wales. So, for example, on Brexit, yes, Cardiff voted Remain, but so did Ceredigion, so did, etc. So did Gwynedd. In terms of general election voting, I mean, Labour did particularly well. So Labour clearly corralled the Remain votes in Cardiff and did very well So I'm not sure. Jack, do you have any reflections on that?
Well, I suppose more recently, specifically, I suppose the last 3 general elections, one thing that's been really key is the link between education and voting preference and vote choice. So people with higher levels of education far more likely to vote for the Labour Party. And in that sense, I suppose Cardiff is quite different from its immediate surroundings. But like Richard said, then it looks very, very similar to all sorts of other places in Wales when you look at other things. So, yeah.
I think for me, I wrote a blog about this under the title Divided Wales. And I think one of the interesting things about Wales is that we tell 2 stories about ourselves and our politics, which are not easily compatible. On the one hand, we've got one-party dominance, which is the defining feature of Welsh politics. It makes Wales look very different from any other democratic country, just to have that level of one-party dominance. On the other hand, we tell a story about Wales, which is Wales is the community of communities. Wales is being incredibly variegated. And my view is that Wales, given the way that politics is going, if values and identity are becoming more important, and it's not that class disappears, but they're mixed into the story of class is mixed into that story in important and interesting ways. Wales is likely to become yet more variegated and heterogeneous over time, and my expectation is that that kind of one-party dominance gets gradually eroded. And fast forward to answer one of the questions I asked at the end of the presentation: does the reduction in the number of Welsh constituencies and the potential for maybe more proportional results also then chip away at Labour dominance? So my expectation is that not just that all of Wales, we're seeing kinds of variegation across Wales with population shifts into the North Wales coast and so on and so on and so forth. There was a great quote from Gwynalf Williams who talked about costa bureaucratica in the south, costa what was it? I can't remember, but basically lots of older people along the North Wales coast and holiday homes burning in the middle of Wales, and that was the kind of his apocalyptic vision of Wales in the early 1980s. I'm not going to kind of paint that picture, but I think this idea that Wales as being more variegated, more divided, and it is the most heterogeneous of all the 4 territories. In Brexit, it had the most pro-European group. It also had the most hostile. They were all in Wales. Wales is all of this, which makes it really interesting for us, but also as scholars, but also quite challenging. Okay, Jack, unless you have anything in particular that you want to add, I think that given that we're a bit long-winded in answering these questions and we want to stop at the hour-and-a-half point, can I just thank you on behalf of the 2 of us and our colleagues and co-workers, Ed Gareth Poole and Dan Wincott. Thank you all for joining us. It's been really nice to have such interest. Thank you for the great questions, which we've really appreciated. As I said, the presentation will be up on YouTube in the next couple of days. We'll share the slides. Doubtless we'll be appearing in party conferences in the future and in the Peerhead, and once COVID has gone, there'll be lots of opportunities to talk in person, but hopefully also virtually in the interim. Thank you all for your interest. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Have a good one.